The lawyer had been reading for about 12 minutes, in the flat, unhurried cadence of someone who has read a great many wills and developed no particular attachment to any of them when he stopped. Not the kind of stop that means turning a page or clearing a throat. A stop that meant something else. He looked down at the document in front of him, then looked up at the room, and then said a name. Nobody moved. He said it again, slightly louder, as if the problem might be acoustics. Every face in the room turned. The son, who'd been sitting with his arms crossed in the way of a man who considers the proceedings a formality between him and an inheritance. The daughter-in-law, who had a legal pad in front of her and had been taking notes. Two cousins I'd noticed when I came in, who had the look of people who hadn't seen each other in long enough that they were still finding things to say. And a young woman in the chair nearest the window, who I hadn't let myself look at directly since I'd sat down. Because when I'd come in, she'd glanced at me with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting me. Which was unsettling given that I had not at all been expecting myself. Every face turned toward me. "That's me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The lawyer nodded with the specific calm of someone who had prepared for this moment and was not surprised by the room's reaction to it. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "if you'll bear with us." I heard the son say something under his breath to the daughter-in-law. I didn't catch the words. I caught the tone, which was the tone of someone calculating a new variable in an equation they'd thought was already solved. I sat in that room and tried to understand how I'd ended up there, in a lawyer's office on a Wednesday morning in March, being looked at by strangers who wanted to know who I was, when I could have told them the answer in a single sentence. I was nobody. I was the neighbor. My name is Noah Callahan. I'm 31 years old, and I teach English at Riverside High School, which means I spend most of my days trying to convince 16-year-olds that the things written on pages have something to do with the lives they're already living, with mixed results that I've made my peace with. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the kind of quiet residential neighborhood where people leave for work at the same time every morning, and the most dramatic thing that usually happens is someone's dog escaping the yard and needing to be returned. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't have a complicated life. I have books and a good coffee maker and a route I walk on Sunday mornings that takes me through the park and back. And I've been mostly content with these things, which I understand is not the most interesting thing a 31-year-old man could say about himself, but which has the advantage of being true. Eleanor Marsh lived in the house, directly next to my apartment building. She'd been there for 40 years. Her husband Henry had died 7 years before I moved in, and she'd stayed on in the house after his death because she said she could still feel the right shape of the place when she moved through it in the dark, which was enough of a reason to stay somewhere, she thought. I met her in November of my first winter in that apartment, when I went out at 6 in the morning to find 7 inches of snow on the ground and Eleanor standing on her front walk in a coat that wasn't warm enough for the temperature, holding a snow shovel with the determined expression of a woman who was going to do the thing she intended to do, regardless of what her body was currently capable of. She was 76 years old, and the shovel was clearly heavier than it should have been for her, and I said good morning and asked if I could help. She looked at me the way older women of a certain self-sufficiency look at offers of help, assessing whether it's patronizing or genuine. Whatever she saw in my face apparently satisfied her because she handed me the shovel. It took me about 20 minutes. When I finished, she invited me in for coffee, which I accepted because I didn't have to be at school until 8:30, and the coffee turned out to be exceptionally good. The kind made with a proper pot and the right amount of grounds. The kind that tastes like someone took it seriously. We sat at her kitchen table for about 40 minutes, and she told me about the neighborhood, what it had been like 20 years ago, which stores had been which, and who had lived where. She had the memory of someone who paid attention, specific and unsentimentally vivid. I went home when I needed to get ready for school, and I thought that was pleasant. She was sharp and funny and made excellent coffee, and the conversation had been better than most conversations I had with people my own age. I didn't think much more about it. The following Saturday morning there was another snowfall, a smaller one, 3 or 4 inches. I went out to clear the walk in front of my building, and then, without particularly deciding to, I walked next door and cleared Eleanor's as well. It took 10 minutes. I didn't knock. I went home and made my own coffee and thought nothing of it. This became the pattern. Not a formal arrangement, not a thing we discussed. I cleared her walk when it snowed. I noticed when the gutter above her porch was loose, and I fixed it the following Saturday because I had the right tools, and it would have become a problem in spring. She started leaving the front light on when she saw my car in the lot in the evening, and I understood this as a signal that meant she wouldn't mind company, Not that she required it, and most weeks I'd stop by once and sit with her in the kitchen or on the porch, depending on the season. She drove herself to appointments for about a year, and then quietly stopped driving. And after that, I drove her to the doctor on Tuesday mornings when I had a free period, which I didn't tell her was specifically why I'd arranged my schedule that way. In return, she told me things. Not as payment, more as what naturally happened between two people who spent time together and trusted each other's company. She told me about Henry, what he'd been like when they were young, the way he'd laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, the woodworking he'd done in the garage on weekends, how she'd kept all his tools in the same place he'd left them because it felt wrong to move things he'd arranged. She told me about her son William, with a careful fondness that told me more about their complicated relationship than anything she said directly. She told me about her granddaughter Lydia, who lived in a city 3 hours away and called every Sunday without fail, whose letters Eleanor kept in a box on the kitchen counter and reread in a way that made me understand the letters were the best part of Eleanor's week. I told her things too. Not everything, but more than I usually told people, more than I would have expected to tell a neighbor 45 years older than me. I told her about Claire, the relationship that had ended the year before I moved in, the specific slow grief of understanding that 2 years of genuine affection hadn't been enough of a foundation, and the longer, quieter work of rebuilding an idea of yourself after something like that. I told her about teaching, the days when it worked, and the days when I felt like I was trying to fill a room with something the room had already decided not to hold. She listened the way good listeners listen, without advice, without the impulse to fix, with the simple regard of someone who takes what you say seriously enough to actually sit with it. Once, after I'd described a particularly bad week in the classroom, she put her coffee mug down and looked at me for a moment and said, "The students who are going to remember you haven't told you yet. They never do until years later." I thought about that sentence for a long time. In the second summer I'd been there, she had a fall in the garden. Not serious, no bones broken, but enough to frighten her in the private way that falls frighten older people, the understanding of what the body is beginning to communicate about its intentions. She didn't tell me directly. I noticed she'd stopped going out into the back garden in the evenings, which had been her habit, and when I asked about it, she told me plainly, because she was a plain-speaking person, what had happened and what she'd made of it. I spent the following Saturday afternoon installing a handrail along the 3 steps to the garden door. She watched me work from the kitchen window, and when I was done, she came out and tested the railing and said, without looking at me, "I'm not going to thank you, because thanking you is starting to feel like a formality neither of us needs." I said that sounded fine to me. It went on for 3 years. I didn't think of it as a friendship exactly, because the word seemed either too small or too formal for what it was. It was more like a habit of mutual attention, the understanding that exists between two people who have decided, without announcing it, that the other one matters. On my 31st birthday in September, she left a card in my mailbox. It said, "Happy birthday, Noah. I've been alive for 79 years, and the things worth celebrating are smaller than you think and bigger than most people will admit. Have very good coffee." I kept the card on my kitchen counter for several months, which is not something I usually do with cards, but then I am not usually given cards by people like Eleanor. Eleanor died in January, a stroke in the night, quietly. I found out when I saw the ambulance from my window at 2 in the morning and understood when it left without lights that the understanding I'd had for a while that this was coming had become true. I stood at the window for a long time without going back to bed. I thought about the Tuesday I'd driven her to the cardiologist 6 weeks earlier, the way she'd been quiet on the way home in a manner different from her usual quiet, less contemplative and more settled, the quality of someone who has received information and has already decided what to do with it. I hadn't asked. She hadn't offered. We'd stopped at the bakery on the way back because she said she wanted a particular kind of cookie they made there. And we sat in the parking lot and ate the cookies, and she said it was a good November afternoon, and I said it was. And that was the last time I drove her somewhere. I went to her porch the morning after she died, because I needed to be in a space that was hers, and I sat in her chair, not the one I usually sat in when we talked, but hers, and I stayed there for about an hour. The garden was dormant, the handrail I'd installed along the garden steps catching the flat winter light. I thought about everything she'd told me and understood that I had been given an enormous amount quietly over 3 years, and that the giving had been deliberate. She'd decided I was worth giving things to. I found that moved me more than I'd expected. William, her son, called me 3 days later. He was polite and brief, the way people are when grief has put them into task mode. He said his mother had spoken of me often and that I should know she'd thought of me as a genuine friend. He said the lawyer would be in touch. I said I was very sorry for his loss, which I meant, and which I also understood was only a portion of what I actually felt, which was my own loss, which I was going to need more time to figure out how to carry. The lawyer's letter arrived 10 days after that. It asked me to attend a reading of the will of Eleanor Ann Marsh on a Wednesday morning in March. It didn't say why, only that my presence was requested. I spent most of the night before the reading trying to figure out what I was going to say when I was asked why I was there. I knew Eleanor had small savings and a house that was worth something, and Henry's woodworking tools in the garage and 40 years of accumulated objects that had meant things to her. I had no expectation of any of it. I thought perhaps she'd left me a book or a letter, or wanted me to have something small that connected to our specific shared history. I thought the whole thing would take 20 minutes and I'd be back in time for second period. The lawyer's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, with the kind of furniture that communicates settled competence without any particular warmth. A long dark table, a window overlooking an alley that received no direct light, chairs arranged with the slight formality of a space that sees people on difficult days and has learned to be neutral about it. I arrived at 9:50, 10 minutes early, and found 3 people already there. The son, William, who was taller than I'd expected from the photograph on Eleanor's mantelpiece, with the particular careful posture of a man who grew up being told to stand up straight and has done it ever since without enjoying it, and the daughter-in-law, whose name I'd learn later was Patricia, who had a legal pad in front of her and a pen at the ready, and who looked at me when I came in with the brief, pleasant expression of someone filing me in an internal category she hadn't settled on yet, and the young woman near the window. The young woman looked at me when I came in, and I knew immediately who she was, not from resemblance, though there was some. The same shape of stillness about the face, the same economy of expression, but from something in the quality of her attention, the same specific directness Eleanor had, the sense of looking at a thing and seeing it, rather than the version of it you've already decided you're looking at. She had dark hair and she was wearing a blue coat, and she was holding a pen she wasn't using, and when she glanced at me her expression was not surprised. It suggested, as I said, that she'd been expecting me. I sat down at the far end of the table from where the lawyer would sit, and I did not look at her again, though I was aware of her in the particular way you're aware of something you've decided not to attend to. The lawyer arrived. The cousins arrived. There was a brief, low period of greeting and small adjustments of chairs and a water pitcher on the table that nobody touched. The reading began. Eleanor had left the house to William. She had left certain objects and savings to Patricia and the cousins. She had left her own jewelry to her granddaughter Lydia and her personal papers and letters, which the lawyer described as considerable in volume, to Lydia as well, and then added, "Your grandmother specified that these were to go to you unopened, that you'd know what to do with them." I watched Lydia absorb this with the same stillness she'd had since I arrived, and I thought about 3 years of Sunday letters in a box on Eleanor's counter and understood that this was probably the most important bequest in the room, just the least visible. And then the lawyer stopped. He looked down at the document, then at the room, and he said my name. I was left Henry's woodworking tools, the full set in the garage, organized in the chest he'd built himself in 1974, and a letter, sealed and addressed to me personally, to be given to me after the formal proceedings concluded. The son's voice came from across the table, careful and controlled. "Who is Noah Callahan?" The lawyer with composure. "A neighbor of your mother's, Mr. Marsh." "For how long?" 3 years, I believe. She described him in the document as a steady presence and a genuine friend. A silence settled into the room that had several distinct textures. The son's had the texture of a man recalibrating an equation he'd thought was settled. The daughter-in-law's had the texture of someone deciding whether to say something and concluding that the moment wasn't quite right. The cousins exchanged a brief look. I was aware of all of it without quite looking at any of it. And the woman near the window, who I now understood with certainty, was Lydia. Her silence had no texture I could name. I looked at her finally, and she was looking at me with an expression that was entirely still and entirely focused. The way her grandmother used to look at things she was trying to understand fully before she said anything about them. Not surprised. Working something out. After the reading, as people were collecting themselves and speaking in the low tones of people who have just been told how they exist in a dead person's mind, Lydia crossed the room to where I was standing. "You're Noah," she said. "Yes." She studied me. "She wrote about you." "In her letters." I hadn't known. It hadn't occurred to me as a possibility. "I didn't know," I said. "Every Sunday I got a letter," Lydia said. For 3 years, at least half of every letter was about you. What you'd talked about, what you'd fixed, that you'd driven her to the cardiologist and waited and then driven her home, that you'd stayed on the porch with her last Tuesday and she'd told you about the summer she and my grandfather drove to the coast in a car that had no air conditioning and broke down in a town neither of them had heard of before and turned out to be the best week of their lives. She paused. She told you all of it. She told me a great deal, I said. She told you more than she told most people, Lydia said. I know, because the things she wrote to me about you were often things she said she'd told you first, to see how they landed on someone she trusted. She looked at me for a long moment. I feel like I know you. That's a strange thing to say to a stranger. It's not that strange, I said, given the circumstances. She almost smiled. No, I suppose not. She looked over her shoulder at the lawyer's desk, where her Uncle William was asking something in a stiff, precise voice. Then she looked back at me. She left you the tools, she said. I know. He built the chest himself, she said. 62 drawers. Every tool has a specific place, and he labeled each one in pencil. She used to say she couldn't move anything because he'd gone to such trouble to decide where everything lived. She paused. She would have wanted someone to use them. She told me that specifically. She couldn't stand the idea of them going somewhere they'd just sit. I don't woodwork, I said. She knew. Lydia looked at me steadily. She said you were exactly the kind of person who would learn. I thought about Eleanor at her kitchen table, saying things she'd decided ahead of time, things she was checking to see how they sounded. I thought about 3 years of Sundays and what she might have said about me, about what she understood about me that she'd rendered in careful handwriting in letters her granddaughter had read every week. The lawyer gave me the sealed letter on the way out, a cream-colored envelope with my name on the front in Eleanor's handwriting, which I recognized immediately as I recognized all the small graphic signatures of her life. The way she arranged things on the kitchen counter, the particular hook she used for her coat, the cup she always chose from the cabinet in a specific order. I shook William's hand, which he offered with the reflexive politeness of a man who is still working out what he thinks of me, and I nodded to Patricia, and I said something brief and genuine to the cousins about being sorry for their loss. And then Lydia pressed a card into my hand, a small card with her name and number on it, and she looked at me with the directness I already associated with her before I'd heard her speak, and she said only, "I'm glad you came." And I said, "I'm glad she had you." And she held my eyes for a moment and then nodded once, and I went to the elevator. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I opened the envelope. The garage was almost entirely empty, mid-morning on a Wednesday, and the particular silence of empty concrete structures, not absence of sound but the presence of a specific kind of acoustic space, made it feel like a private room. Eleanor's handwriting was careful and slightly formal, the penmanship of someone who had learned to write in an era when it mattered and had never let the standard slip. It said, "Noah, I imagine you are surprised. I hope you're not too uncomfortable about the tools. Henry would have wanted a person who does things properly to have them. You do most things properly. I've been watching for 3 years. I've been writing to my granddaughter for the same length of time about the particular quality of your attention. Because I'm an old woman with a great deal of time to think, and I know a rare quality when I sit with it for 3 winters. She's a good person. She takes after me in the ways that count. I thought you might like to know that. I also thought you might like to know that she reads the letters I send her 3 times, which is how I know she's actually listening and not just being dutiful. You'll find out the rest for yourself. Take care of the tools." Henry named them all. The small hand plane is Gerald. Don't ask me why. I sat with the letter for a while longer, feeling the particular warmth of being known by someone who didn't announce it while they were doing it. Then I drove home, and I thought about Lydia reading letters in a city 3 hours away every Sunday, reading the same things Eleanor had said to me in the kitchen, working out from the same words what kind of person I was. I texted the number Lydia had written on the card she'd pressed into my hand outside the lawyer's office. I said, "I got the letter." She replied within 2 minutes. She told me she'd written you one. She wouldn't tell me what it said. I typed. She said you read her letters 3 times. A pause. Then, "That feels like something I should have kept to myself." I wrote, "It's a good quality." Another pause, slightly longer. Then, "She said you stayed on the porch with her last Tuesday and she told you the story about the trip to the coast." "Yes," I wrote. "She said it was the first time she'd told anyone the whole version. She always left the end out before because she said most people couldn't hold the ending properly. She said you could." I sat with my phone in my car in the parking garage, not quite ready to drive home yet. Outside the narrow window at the end of the structure, the March sky was doing the thing it does in early spring. Gray and white, and occasionally, suddenly, the specific pale blue of something that's been waiting through winter. I thought about Gerald the hand plane, and what kind of person names their tools, and what it means to arrange things so carefully that other people are still finding the arrangement after you're gone. I wrote to Lydia. What was the end she always left out? She wrote back. She said when the car broke down and they spent the week there, my grandfather proposed. On a Tuesday, in a town he'd never heard of. He said he'd been trying to find the right moment for 3 months and running out of ideas. And then the car broke down and there was no moment planned and nothing to do but say it. I read this and thought about Henry's tools in their labeled drawers, and Eleanor sitting on her porch telling me the parts of the story she'd decided to tell and leaving one out. And I understood then what she'd been doing. She'd been saving it, not for herself. She'd been saving it for the right moment to give away. What did she say yes to? I asked immediately. Everything, apparently. That's how she always ended it when she did tell it. She said yes to everything. We met for coffee the following Saturday in the middle city, equidistant from her apartment and mine. She was already there when I arrived, with a tea instead of coffee and a notebook on the table she wasn't using. And when I came in, she looked at me with the same expression she'd had in the lawyer's office. Direct, unhurried, already paying attention. I sat down. I told the server coffee, black. She watched me order, and then she said you take your coffee the way you do most things. Simply, and like you mean it. I looked at her across the table in the morning light. This woman who had read letters about me for 3 years and knew me in the specific, sidelong way you know someone through a person who loved you both. She was usually right, I said. I know, Lydia said. I've been paying attention for 3 years, too.